Hello friends, welcome back. Let's talk about Shelley's Ode to the West Wind again. Let's try to understand technical details of the poem. You know that the poem Ode to the West Wind is about west wind. The west wind is described as the powerful and destructive force. It drives away the summer and brings winter storms, chaos, and even death. The west wind is not peaceful or pleasant. It is the breath of autumn's being. Autumn is a transitional season when summer's abundance begins to fade. The west wind strips the leaves from the trees, whips the sky, and causes huge storms on the ocean. In the first section of the poem, the speaker compares the dead leaves the west wind blows to ghosts and pestilence-stricken multitudes. The west wind turns the fall colors, that is autumn colors, into something scary associated with sickness and death. Similarly, the clouds in the poem's second section look like the bright hair uplifted from the head of a fierce Maenad. In Greek mythology, the Maenad were the female followers of Dionysus, the god of wine. They were famous for their wild parties and their dancing. They are often shown with their hair lifted up. The west wind thus makes the clouds wild and drunk. It creates chaos. It is different from the spring. Spring spreads sweet smells and beautiful flowers. This can happen because wind drives the leaves and seeds from one place to another and scatters it everywhere. Poet calls the west wind a destroyer as well as a preserver. Indian gods Shiva and Vishnu are the gods of creation and destruction. Shiva destroys and Vishnu preserves. There is a third god who is associated with creation in Indian mythology. Brahma is considered as the creator along with Shiva the destroyer and Vishnu the preserver, forming the trio. The west wind combines opposite figures. Poet concludes by saying, if winter comes, O wind, can spring be far behind? Thus, west wind destroys as well as creates. Throughout Ode to the West Wind, poet praises and celebrates the west wind's power. It is destructive and chaotic, but the poet thinks that such destruction is necessary for rebirth and renewal. The poet wants to take, adopt, or absorb the west wind's power into his poetry. The poet describes himself as a diminished person, chained and bowed. The poet thinks that the west wind will revive him. At one point, the poet asks the wind to make me thy lyre even as the forest is. He wants to be the lyre, a musical instrument of the wind like the forest. When wind blows through the forest, the sound is created. Poet personifies the wind as a person and forest as a lyre. Wind becomes the musician and the forest becomes musical instrument here. And the poet wants wind to use him as it uses the forest. Poet wants to be the west wind because he wants to create something new, to clear away the old and the dead. Under the west wind's influence, his or her dead thoughts will quicken a new birth. Poet thinks that newness can't be achieved through compromise with old and dead. It can emerge only through the cleansing destruction that the west wind brings. Now let's dive in and try to understand some of the technical facts about the poem. The poem begins by talking directly to the west wind. Talking directly to an object is an instance of apostrophe. Apostrophe is a figure of speech in which objects are directly addressed. It is also an example of personification. Personification is also a figure of speech. In personification, ideas or objects are given the qualities of the human being or a person. As objects and ideas are treated as the person, it is called personification. Throughout the poem, the pronouns like thou, thee, and thine are used. There are also a few instances of alliteration in this poem. Alliteration is a repetition of a sound. Okay, the instances of alliteration in this poem are, look at the line, wild west wind. The sound woo is repeated. Look at the line, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. Sound l is repeated. So sweet, the sense fence picturing them. Sound s is repeated. The sea blooms and oozy woods which wear. Sound woo is repeated. And sweet though in sadness be thou spirit fierce. Sound s is repeated. Now let's see the examples of caesura in the poem. Caesura is a natural pause within the line of a poem. It is often marked by the full stop, semicolon, hyphen, ellipsis, or a comma, or so on. Look at the first line in the first part of the poem. O wild west wind. There is comma after O wild west wind, and the poem begins, thou breath of autumn's being. So this is an instance of caesura. Look at fifth line in the first part of the poem. Pestilence stricken multitudes. There is semicolon after multitudes, and the meaning changes after that. Look at seventh line, the winged seeds. After that there is a comma and then continues where they lie cold in low. That is in the line 7. This is also an example of caesura. There is an instance of caesura in the concluding line of the first section after preserver. There is a semicolon which is an instance of caesura. Now let's move on to the second section of the poem. Fourth line of the second section. Have a look at that. After the word lightning, there is a colon. This is an example of caesura. Then come to the line 7th. After the word menad, there is a comma. That is also an example of caesura. Now line 9. After storm, there is a full stop. That is naturally a strong pause, and that is caesura. And to the 14th line, burst. After burst, there is a colon, which is also an example of caesura. Come to the third section of the poem. In the 8th line of the third section of the poem, after the word them, there is a exclamatory mark, which is an example of caesura. And in the 14th line of the same section, after themselves, there is a colon. That is also an example of caesura. Come to the fourth section of the poem. In the 5th line of the fourth section of the poem, then thou, O uncontrollable. After that, there is also an exclamatory mark. Then come to ninth line, that is scarce seemed the vision. After vision, there is a semicolon. Come to 12th line, of life, there is an exclamatory mark. So these are some of the instances of caesura in this poem. Now let's try to understand the examples of enjambment in the poem. Enjambment is also called run-on line. When earlier line in a poem runs into next line, it is called run-on line or enjambment. Here we'll discuss the examples of run-on line in the first part of the section. Rest of the parts you can find them out. Okay. Now let us look at the line number 5. Look at line number 5. From 5th line to the 12th line, each line runs into the next line. Each earlier line runs into the next line. See this. See, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds. Who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds. When winged seeds are charioted to their dark wintry beds. Next line, see the line 7th, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse. Cold and low, each like a corpse. Then again, the 7th line runs into 8th line, and look at the 8th line, like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of spring. Again, 8th line runs into 9th line, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow. 9th into 10th, a clarion o'er the dreaming earth, and fill. 10th into 11th, driving sweet birds like flocks to feed in air. 11th into 12th, feed in air with living hues in orders plain and hill. Here there is a semicolon. That means the stanza ends here. Let's try to read out from 5th line to the 14th line together. O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet birds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues in orders plain and hill. Thus, the sentence that began with 5th line ends on the 12th line. It's really interesting to find out run-on lines in the poem. I request you to go to the other parts, other sections of the poem, and try to find out run-on lines in all the sections of this poem. Now, to the simile. Simile is the comparison between two things or objects with the help of words like, as like as, etc. There are a few examples of simile in the poem. For example, example number 1, thou from whose unseen presence the dead leaves are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. What is compared here? Dead leaves. What kind of dead leaves? Driven dead leaves are compared with ghosts running away from the enchanter. Look at the second example, each like a corpse within its grave. What is compared here? The seeds in their bed are compared with corpse within its grave. Look at the third example. Loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. Loose clouds are compared with earth's decaying leaves. And fourth example, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce minute. Again, the loose clouds are compared with the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce minute. Now let's understand the structure of the poem. The poem is written in terza rima. Terza rima is a verse composed of iambic tercets. What is tercet? Tercet is a 3-line group. The rhyme scheme of terza rima is A, B, A, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, E, D, and so on. The second line of each earlier tercet sets the rhyme for the following tercet. There are 4 tercets and a rhyming couplet in each section of the poem. Thus, each section of West Wind becomes a separate sonnet. That means there are 5 sonnets in Ode to the West Wind. However, they are not regular sonnets like other Italian or English sonnets. Before I end this video, let me tell you something about this poem. There seems to be a specific reason for Shelley to choose terza rima as the stanza form for this poem. Terza rima was most famously used by the Italian poet Dante in his epic poem The Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy describes the soul's descent into hell and its subsequent ascent to heaven. Don't you think that there is some kind of similarity between the Divine Comedy and Ode to the West Wind? Don't you think that soul's descent can be connected with the destruction and subsequent rise can be connected with the rebirth? Think of more similar things about this poem and enjoy your days in literature, because literature is the source of delight. Have this delight. I hope you have liked this video. If you have liked it, please hit the like button, subscribe for the channel and share this video with your friends. Thank you very much for watching.